Hey, Nish here, and I was using my old Asus VivoBook laptop for way too long and recently decided to invest in a new laptop. After a reasonable amount of time researching and weighing up the various options, I ended up with this HP Pavilion 14. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about some of the trade-offs I identified in this journey to buying a new laptop, and along the way I'm going to give you some tips which will hopefully help you make a good decision. The first major thing is that I'm going to be mainly talking about Windows laptops. That is the big first decision, obviously, to make when you're buying a laptop these days. I am not too keen on Apple because, well, I didn't really want to sell one of my kidneys in order to buy a laptop, so I'm a Windows person. If you happen to be of the Mac variety, this video will not be very useful. So aside from that, the first major decision you're going to want to make with a laptop is what form factor you want. Now, the most common screen sizes are 13.3, 14, 15.6, and 17 inch. I personally ended up with 14. I think it's a good trade-off between portability and still having a usable screen size, though it is worth noting that 15.6 inch laptops will typically potentially have better specs for the price. I imagine that the size of the laptop, the smaller you get, the more complicated it is to fit in all the components and thermals and what have you. So that is worth considering. If you're not going to move around too much with the laptop, then it might be worth going for that size. For me, 13.3 inch gets a bit too small, but it is worth noting that the aspect ratio of the screen can actually affect the real estate. So for example, a 13.3 inch screen that has an aspect ratio of say 3:2 instead of the typical 16:9 might actually be very similar to a 14-inch 16:9 screen, so that's worth considering. Before I move on to talking about the processor and GPU, I'd really appreciate if you could subscribe if you like what you're seeing so far. Helps the video get out there and the channel to grow. When it comes to the CPU, gone are the days in the distant past where you wouldn't really touch AMD with a barge pole. These days, AMD and Intel are neck and neck, and for example, in the latest generation, so I'm speaking in June 2022, the AMD 5000 series typically is considered to win out in a lot of ways over the Intel 11th gen. Of course, Intel 12th gen is being rolled out, so there's always a bit of a competition leapfrogging thing going on with them. Generally speaking, the jumps made in performance for successive processor generations have got smaller and smaller as time has gone on, but it's still worth getting the most up-to-date generation you can so that you've got that extra bit of longevity. One decision that is invariant of the generation is which tier to go for. Now, conveniently, Intel and AMD both have this 3-tier 357 system. In my opinion, if you're going to be doing anything that's reasonably taxing on the CPU, then you probably want an i5 and up, but that's where you tend to get more cores and a more capable processor. If you're just looking for basic tasks, an i5 might be a bit overkill, but will give you a lot of processing headroom. Now, in my case, I was looking to do some video editing and maybe play some little light games, and so I did want to get a decent amount of horsepower so that I'd have a laptop that could stand the test of time a little bit. For that reason, I ended up with a Ryzen 7 in this laptop, the HP Pavilion, which I'm pointing to in the distance, and I was amazed that I could actually get that for only about £500, and otherwise I would have been going for something like an i5. When it comes to GPU, obviously, if you're looking to play a lot of 3D games, then integrated graphics probably isn't going to cut it. For example, in the case of the AMD Ryzen 7 I have here, I tried to run Path of Exile and it really struggles. I can play Hearthstone, really basic stuff, but it's just never going to be up to the task. And what you really want, ideally, if you want a good gaming experience, then you want a dedicated graphics card, and that might affect a lot of the other decisions in this laptop buying process. One thing worth noting though is that Intel typically tend to have better integrated graphics compared to AMD. That being said though, you're still not going to get, I think, a good experience with an Intel integrated graphics, but you might get a more passable experience playing simpler games. A quick mention to RAM. In my opinion, you don't want to be caught without at least 8 GB these days. I mean, 4 GB is just not going to cut it. That's what most phones have these days, and you only have to open up a few tabs in Chrome and a couple other things before you're running against the headroom there. I ended up with 16 gig because I wanted to have a bit of headroom, and generally I'd recommend, if you can, to get a bit of headroom so that you never run into problems with memory. One trade-off you might come across when you're looking to buy a new laptop is the different tiers of build quality and luxuriousness that you come across with a lot of manufacturers. For example, HP have their Pavilion and Envy, Dell have their Inspiron and XPS, Asus have their VivoBook and ZenBook. I could go on. What you tend to have is these lower tier products that maybe they're made of plastic, more budget materials, and then you have their premium line, which has more sophisticated materials, usually better screens, but generally features that are, the icing or the cherry on the top of the cake. Sometimes these trade-offs are a bit tricky because a lot of the product ranges are going to have overlaps in the types of processors and specs that they have. You just have these extra factors to consider. Even in my case, there was the HP Pavilion I was looking at, and there was also another variant called the Pavilion Aerobook. And this was about 300 to 400 grams lighter, and it had a slightly better screen, but apart from that, all of the specs were the same at a cost of about 25% more. And in the end, I decided not to spend that extra 150 euros or whatever it was because, I don't know, in my head, the trade-off just wasn't quite worth it. Now, in hindsight, maybe I'm considering, maybe that, slightly lighter weight might have been worthwhile. It's tricky to know, but it's worth having a little think, and particularly seeing a lot of laptops in person is going to help you decide whether the premium build and features actually matter to you, or if you're better off focusing your budget on getting the best specs possible. There is one thing I noticed though that might be relevant, and it's that on the cheaper laptops, the budget ranges, the screen hinges tend to have a really small range of angles. And this is a pretty niche use case, but if you want to use a laptop riser to use your laptop with a monitor and put the screens on the same level, then you might run into problems there. I didn't realize until I received my Pavilion 14 that the screen doesn't open that much, and it was a little annoyance, so I thought I'd mention it in case it is of value to you. While we're on the topic of the hinge, let's talk about the screen. Now, first off, resolution-wise, in my opinion, 1080p is fine. Like, on the typical size of laptop screens, I don't think you need much more than that. You could arguably have a different opinion, but that's my viewpoint. The other main variation in screens is the screen technology being used. Now, the most cheap and awful is what's called a TN panel. I think not a lot of laptops these days will have those because they have awful viewing angles and the colors aren't as nice. What you'll typically see is IPS screens, which have very good viewing angles and good colors. The new technology that is starting to be rolled out for some manufacturers, I think Asus, one of the first ones that have them, is OLED screens. Now, OLED screens, if you aren't aware, they have much richer, vibrant colors, and they have much deeper blacks. The trade-off, however, is that these screens typically can't get as bright as their LCD IPS counterparts, so it is worth considering if you're going to be using the screen outdoors. When I saw these screens like side by side, it was quite noticeable the difference in brightness achievable on an LCD versus the OLED. Another decision is between glossy and matte, so that's the finish that is applied to the screen. Not many manufacturers use glossy screens, to be honest. I noticed Lenovo had a couple, and the LG Gram uses really obnoxiously glossy screens. I am a big fan of matte screens because they reduce the amount of reflections you see, they reduce the amount of glare, and for that reason, I think most manufacturers go with that. The exception is, however, for touch screens, which tend to be glossy because they're using, different stacks of materials, and certain materials maybe are better for having the touch controls, I imagine. Touch or no is going to be a fairly personal decision. In my opinion, I think a lot of laptops, the 2-in-1 laptops, these are the ones where the hinge goes all the way around and folds onto itself. It's a bit of a gimmick. Your typical laptop that weighs, 1.4, 1.5 kilograms is just not going to be that comfortable to use as a laptop. There is also a cost trade-off associated with these 2-in-1 style laptops. In my experience, you end up paying about 50 to 100 euros or dollars more just for that functionality, for the same specs, but then having that 2-in-1 functionality. You do, of course, have your really premium tablet-style PCs, so these are things like the Microsoft Surface, but you're paying a huge premium for that, though admittedly they do work really well as tablets. At the end of the day, you have to decide whether touch is going to be something you're going to use on a day-to-day basis. In my case, I decided I probably wasn't going to. I mean, it can be even useful sometimes with the screen to point at stuff instead of using the mouse, but ultimately I decided against it and to maximize my specs. Okay, so I thought I'd summarize this video by going through a checklist of questions and things to ask yourself when you're buying a new laptop. The first thing is, what form factor do you want? Second, you have your processor. Which manufacturer is dominant right now? How much horsepower do you really need? Are you going to be looking to do some activities that require some horsepower, or do you just want something that can fly for your basic tasks? 3, what kind of screen do you want? Do you want a touch screen? Do you want OLED potentially? Do you care that much about resolution? Do you care about a more premium lightweight build? Or do you prefer to focus on getting the best specs for the price? In which case you'd probably want to look for the more budget lines that laptop manufacturers offer. One thing I haven't mentioned is to check the battery size. Now, you can check the specs of a battery by looking at how many watt hours it has. This is an objective measure of how much energy is stored in the battery, and you can typically find it on the manufacturer's websites. You don't always see it on retailer websites. I think this is a better way to compare different laptops because sometimes you have up to X hours use, and I don't think it's a particularly objective measure. And that is everything I wanted to talk about in this video. I hope it was useful. I know some of this stuff maybe is common sense, or I'm not even sure. It's just some of the things that I was thinking about when I was buying this laptop, and hopefully it's useful to someone out there, because I think these days it's sometimes really hard to buy items of technology. There's so much choice and options out there, and I think anything that can help you reduce down, funnel down into something that's going to fulfill your needs but also come in at a good cost is hopefully a good service to the world or something. Thanks again for watching. Do subscribe for more to the point content, and I'll catch you in the next one.